What's going on YouTube? Welcome to another live oil painting session. So we are going to continue working on this Rembrandt that we started last time. I am not going to oil out the entire painting. Rather, this time I think what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about and of course demonstrate how you can work on a sunken in painting without oiling out the entire painting. Now there's only really one reason that you want to do that if you're going to work on a painting that has sunken in like this one has, and they're all going to sink in, which means that I'll just show you what it means. When a painting sinks in, it means that if you get a little bit of medium and you just test it out in like say right here, right? You see how much darker that looks? Okay, so I'll only add a little bit of medium to this portion. Hey hippie artist. Okay, so that's just medium added there, and it makes that look as dark as it looks. If I were to continue working on this painting for about a month or so, then I don't want to oil out the entire painting because I want to build the layers through more lean film of paint. So this is already pretty lean because I didn't use any medium here, which is why this has sunken in, because I didn't use medium in the beginning, which is what you want to do. So we're going to talk about layering and structure today as we continue this painting. So the layering aspect is what we're going to talk about first. Let's talk about it while we mix up some color, because we got to mix up some color quickly now. So you want to layer leaner at first, meaning you don't want to use too much medium. However, if you don't oil out the entire painting, it doesn't mean that you can't use any medium. Hey Tommy, thanks for watching from Finland. It doesn't mean that you can't add medium. It's that instead of adding medium to the entire painting, like I did there, you'll just add medium directly to your paint as needed, which is another way that you can work. Not as common of a way to work, but you can do that. So remember, the reason that you don't want to oil out your entire painting sometimes is if you're going to work on it a lot. If this were to be the last layer on this painting, which it might be, I don't know, we'll see. If this were to be the last layer on this study, then I would be perfectly fine to oil it out. I'm only going to be able to work on this an hour today, so I don't think that I'm going to try to take this to a finish. So I'm not going to oil out the entire thing. So remember, this is a live painting session, so please feel free to ask any art-related questions, any painting questions that come to mind. Right now what I'm doing is I'm mixing up lead white, burnt sienna, some of the blues or some of the greens, usually ultramarine blue, but I'm using cobalt blue this time. I'm just going to warm up somewhere. I'm going to essentially match a color. I don't know which color. Let's just say whatever. Let's test this color out. And that is pretty light. And I did work a little dark at first. You're actually looking at the light sensitivity high. It is bright. So this should not look that light. This is not a good camera view. This shouldn't look this light. So that means that I need to turn down my light sensitivity. Maybe one more to about there. And that means that you'll be able to see more detail on this paint tube. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to build up some of the lights more opaque. Hey Libertas, hey Jonas. So we are going to build up thicker paint with little to no medium at all. Doesn't mean you can't add medium, it's just that if you want thicker paint, use lead white. If you can't use lead white, then use more titanium white with more of this color. Or you can use a lead white replacement. One of those will work just fine. Hey, AP artist. Okay, so Oh, right. So describing the term oiling out. Let's talk about that. The question is oiling out, more medium early while starting, less medium or none at the end. Trying to understand. No, don't apologize. Don't worry. I like when you ask these questions. So, oiling out, what does it mean? Oiling out means when you see that? The little bit of medium there? Oiling out means that you add medium on the entire thing. That's what oiling out means. To bring back the values and the luminosity that the painting originally had when it was wet. That is the definition of oiling out. You typically don't want to do that in your earlier layers if you're going to have a multi-layered painting. So if you're going to have like 10 layers to your painting or something like that, then you probably don't want to oil out on your second layer, which is where we are now. If I'm only going to put maybe like 3 layers on this thing or 2 layers, then I can oil it out and it wouldn't be a problem. Now the reason for that is fat over lean. Second part of your question. Earlier on in your painting, you want to have more paint, less medium. Later, maybe like after 10 layers or so, then you can introduce a lot more oil, a lot more medium, and then paint because your underlayer is more solid. So the more paint and the less medium, the less fluidity in your earlier layers, the denser your film is going to be, the more compacted, another way to say dense, the more compacted your film is, the sturdier your painting will be throughout the years. That's pretty much what fat over lean means. So if there's more confusion about it, I can talk more about it. No, that's not, so I don't need to hold back on medium till the last layer. It's just that I want to minimize how much medium I use until the final layer. I could use medium now if I wanted to. I just don't want to use too much because I'm anticipating that I'm going to have more layers on this painting. That's all. So hopefully that makes sense. So think about earlier in the painting if you're going to layer it a lot. Let's assume we're going to put 10 layers on this. Earlier, use less medium. So say layers like 1 through 3, use very little medium. Say layers 4 through 5, I can use a little bit more medium. Say layers 5 through 10, I can use even more medium to the point where now I'm glazing color onto it. So, and this video will be here for everyone to watch after the stream ends, so you can watch it as a pre-recorded video in case anything I said is overly confusing. Thanks for watching from Sweden. So I'm building up the paint a little bit more so there's more texture to it. Not a lot of texture. I'm not using too much impasto. For those of you Rembrandt fans who like to use impasto, I'm not using too much. I'm just kind of rounding out some of the structure on the forehead. There's medium on my palette there. That's Neo-Megilp medium, which is a moderate dryer. It's not a fast dryer. So you can use mediums in the beginning as long as they're fast dryers. You want your earlier layers to dry faster than your later layers. So that's actually why fat over lean is described the way it is, because traditionally people only used either walnut oil or linseed oil, mainly linseed oil. So logically, the less oil you used, if we're talking linseed oil, the faster your painting would dry. Because back in the day, back in the Baroque times or whatever, they didn't have faster drying mediums. I mean, it wasn't as commonly used. I'm sure they had them. Like what we have now. We have Liquin, we have Galkid, we have Neo-Megilp, this one that's like a moderately fast dryer. We have Venetian medium from Rublev. So we've got much more chemistry available to us that the old masters didn't have. Hey Ian, you had a go at this one. You had a problem with the placement of the left eye as you look at it. Um, yeah, the eyes are not aligned in the original. I don't think that's your fault. The eyes are not aligned properly in the original painting. So that's not something you did. That's in the original Rembrandt. It's not aligned perfectly. Hey Hunter, don't know what that means. Alright, so this is where we're warming up. We're adding some more light, some more thickness to the paint film. Remember, you don't have to use lead white if you don't want to. It's typically better for portraiture because it allows you to paint with thicker paint and gives you more control in the mid-tone ranges. We're not going to get as much of a thick kind of crust to the paint film that you would get with denser, a more dense application of oil paint. Alright, standing back. Alright, so let's get to the structure now, the more subtle things. First, I'm going to fix this. This is sticking out a little bit too much. Remember that the camera is at an angle with respect to the painting so that I don't have to reach over the camera when I'm painting. You can actually see the camera right behind me in that camera angle with the webcam. Well, I'm mixing a dark, and because the paint is wet, this is going to look very dark, so you probably can't see it with that camera angle. So I like to use Ultramarine Blue, Alizarin, and some green, preferably Viridian, but this is I think this is Verona green from Rublev to make a black. You could use black paint if you want to, especially for a Rembrandt study. He more than likely used that instead. I'm adjusting that because that angle was off. Hey Janice. So let's adjust that little drawing mistake. Now we'll get into the eyes. A little tricky because there's not much information for the eyes, so we're going to start off with, let's make this a tad bit lighter, maybe a little cooler. Now Rembrandt wouldn't have used this. He would have just used like a vine black or a carbon black. So let's just indicate where the eyes are gonna go. I already placed this one down last time. So we're essentially gonna just pick up where we left off. The eyes are not aligned. This axis doesn't correspond well with the nose or the mouth in the original. I will try to stay true to that as much as I can, but I might edit it. Some of the darks there, so I'm over darkening it at first. Then I'm going to paint into that. And I didn't use straight black, you can tell, because I don't have it on the palette, and I added burnt sienna to that. And this is another layering thing, because the paint is sunken in. This gives you one advantage, a pretty big one actually, is that everything is going to be somewhat compressed. So the darks are not going to be anywhere near as dark looking in this layer. Once this layer sinks in, now this is kind of complicated, so I'm going to talk about this throughout the entire hour that we're going to be painting here. Once this sinks in, these darks are still going to look darker than that, just because you have a layer added to it, and I'll explain more about that. Hey Jonas, does a loose brush stroke mean just leave it there, kind of like tiling? Does a loose brush stroke mean leave it there like tiling? Let's see. A loose brushstroke is a very vague term. I think somebody that uses the term loose brushstroke uses it in a context probably differently than someone else would, but I will try to give it my best go. A loose brushstroke would mean to me a brushstroke that is very evident. To me, a loose brushstroke would be an obvious brushstroke. It wouldn't be like, for example, like what I'm doing here. You'll rarely see me use what I would call a loose brushstroke because I'd really have to try hard to make it look like it only took one brushstroke rather than like 1,000 to get a certain effect. You can think of someone like John Singer Sargent, who everybody seems to really refer to these days in terms of anything painting related. Sargent would use a loose brushstroke. He would show it as a loose brushstroke, but it wouldn't happen that quickly. He wouldn't just put down one brushstroke and it's just in the right spot and perfect. He'd have to work for it. He was human. He was not going to get the same brushstroke the first try that you would see in the end, which is one of the reasons why he's famous for wiping eyes and things off of his paintings and then repainting it, which is not something I would recommend you do, but it's just one of the ways that he would try to get a very loose stroke. Now, I like that you asked that question because when I started this last time, I started it very loose, meaning like you can still see that. Those are pretty much just first try kind of brush strokes because I was working very broad all around the picture differently than I normally would approach it. But I did it that way because this Rembrandt is from his later years. At least it's attributed to him right now. It's from his later years, so it uses more of that free kind of anything goes kind of aesthetic to it. So a loose brushstroke is a brushstroke that is obvious. It's an obvious 1, 2, 3 brushstrokes for an eye instead of let me try 1,000 times to get this shape and this shape and this shape to look like an eye. So that's what a loose brushstroke means. I would prefer the 1,000 little attempts to get that eye just right instead of trying to make it look like 3 individual little perfect brush strokes to give me that eye. Always think about the brush stroke as the font to your favorite book. You don't care that much about the font of the book unless you're looking at the calligraphy or something like that. And then if it's calligraphy, then that's a different thing. But always think about the brush stroke as the font to a book. So we're throwing in a little piece of light there for the sclera. Now remember everyone, just because a painting looks loose like a Sorolla, like a Rembrandt, a Sargent, it doesn't mean that they painted it that way, very loosely. Rembrandt is probably an exception. I think that he, in his later years, did paint like that, which is why some of his paintings are a little better than others. He didn't quite have the history yet that painters like Sargent and Sorolla had of very painterly looking paintings. He was inventing it as he was going. Oh, good. I'm glad, Jonas. I'm glad that my explanation was somewhat clear. So structure-wise, I'm going into these shapes. One little piece at a time, trying to describe the form. First, I put my foot down with the darkest darks. And I got some allergies in here, but anyway. So I put my foot down with the darkest darks first because this layer is sunken in like that. But now this gives me more control because I can go that much darker now. And that's one little trick when you're layering. If you don't oil it out, you do have an advantage of everything else being a little bit more, everything else being a little bit lighter because the colors have sunken in. And then once you oil it out later, the layer that you added on without oiling this out, these darks are still going to look darker than those darks. And I know that's a little complicated to take in, so I'll keep explaining it in different ways to make it as clear as possible. Another nice thing about layering your oil paint is if you are using quality oil paints, they should dry within a couple days, sometimes overnight. And it doesn't even have to be a fast drying color. Sometimes, like lead white, it will make, say like this, would probably be touch dry tomorrow. Enough for me to work on it, which was the case last time when we were working on that other Rembrandt in a much more controlled manner than this. This is a little chaotic. Which is another reason, frankly, another reason I didn't oil this out was because I wasn't too proud of the way that this looked. So why would I bring attention towards something that I'm not really too proud to show? I'd rather it fade back. So if your last layer was a little meh, like if you're not as confident with your previous layer, don't oil it out because you don't want to bring attention to it. Instead, let it be sunken in so that you can build on it and make it better without the older layer, the one that's meh like this, showing through. Meh meaning ugh. Like here we say if we don't like something, we're just like meh. Like that's kind of like our facial expressions when we don't like something. So that's another reason, not even related to fat over lean or anything technical like that. I just wasn't happy with the way that looked. So I didn't want to bring attention to it. I wanted to bring attention away from it and build on it. That's more of a psychological reason for what I did. I'm building the structure around the eye. I don't care about the brush stroke. I'm more focused on what information is being portrayed. And remember everyone, these are long-term studies, so they're not going to be done in just one or two streams. These live streams are long format, an hour at a time, sometimes more. And that is in the effort to provide you with more useful painting footage and content. Hey hippie, I'm making your brain hurt. Oh, my bad. In the attempt of making people's brains hurt less, I'm going to talk about something easier to talk about, like color. So I'm using primarily burnt sienna, as you can see, a lot of burnt sienna in there. Burnt sienna, cobalt blue, white, a tad bit of yellow ochre, and I'm turning form a little bit. That's one of the things about painting is if you're painting for hours and hours at a time, you're gonna be both physically and mentally exhausted. Kind of like working on a jigsaw puzzle for hours and hours at a time. You're gonna be both mentally and physically tired. I like cobalt blue in the lights because it's a little bit thicker. A little bit thicker, so I have a heavier mixture of paint. I'm gonna add some more color to the shadow. Cobalt blue also dries pretty fast. At least mine does. I'm using the Williamsburg Cobalt Blue. There's some of the sclera of his eye showing in the other direction. Go to the close-up. Layering is a pretty complicated topic, I think, in oil painting. Most of what you'll see on YouTube, at least at first glance, is going to be alla prima, or an edited video where no one really shows what happens between steps 4 and 5 or whatever. So when you get into the nuances of layering a painting, that's where a lot of ambiguity happens. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, they don't want to show it. Because frankly, it's the boring stuff. I mean, if you're sitting here and you're watching this attentively, that means you're really trying to learn. Because I know this is boring stuff for most of you. So if you have the patience to sit and watch the boring stuff and you learn from it, it will also build your patience level in painting. I think most of us painters are visual learners. So hopefully the hours that you'll spend watching this, hopefully you'll learn something from them. And remember, in my online classes, I do the same thing. I will film and I'll talk, I'll explain, The difference is that those paintings become class projects that they can share with me each week. So there's that interaction between teacher and student. But if you don't want any of part of that, if you just want to work on your own, this is perfect for you. But if you want direct advice from me, then that's how I do it. Very carefully turning that form. Another thing is there's like a million ways to make a painting. You don't have to work in the same method or with the same materials to get a certain effect. Some methods are easier than others. Some methods are more fun for certain artists than others. That's a good quote there. He wrote, "Knowledge is awesome. I paint by instinct and always have. Therefore, anything I learn is a bonus." Interesting. Well, instinct should be a part of it, definitely. I think instinct is gained through knowledge, through learning. Once you learn something, it just becomes second nature. It becomes instinct. So you have a very valid point there. Notice how often I'm going back and forth. That's not because I'm standing here and doing a dance for you. It's because it's like ingrained in me to always stand back. It's also useful to use a mirror sometimes. I got one and then I lost it. It's somewhere in here. I'll probably have it tomorrow. But tomorrow, like I said, I'm usually going to be here between Tuesday and Friday, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Usually, I can't promise every day, but those are the days you're likely to catch me here live. So I'm leaving myself enough room to be able to work the rest of this stuff around here tomorrow or the next day. Even most full-time painters like myself are not able to work on the same painting for hours and hours, day and night, Monday through Friday. Typically, that's not the way it is. We've got so many other things we have to do: varnishing paintings, preparing canvases, teaching classes, going to painting groups, which is the case for me. So you need to be able to layer and work in such a way that you can come back to it the next day. So someone mentioned the word tiling. So this is a similar approach to a tiling method where you're going like one tile at a time, one piece at a time without any blending. I typically will feather the edges around, which is a type of blending, but I will kind of like do a little zigzag between the edges. But as you see, I am working one little piece at a time. Alright, so the chat is pretty quiet. I'm gonna ask everyone one of those questions I usually ask, and the first one I'm gonna start off with is, what is on your easel today? You already know what's on my easel. What's currently on your easel? Nothing is a valid answer if you haven't had any time to paint. Or if you don't have an easel, you can say not applicable. Hey Treasure, you're working on a floral still life. Awesome. Hey hippie artist. Ooh, a Rembrandt study. A lady with puffy hair. Can't think of which one that is, but I'm glad that you're also painting. Jonas, working on a portrait of Jennifer Aniston, working on the hair with a fan brush. Cool. Hey, tell me you wrote. I've heard that some artists burn. Uh-oh. Let's see. I don't think that that's something we can talk about in the chat. But I wouldn't suggest it if you're trying to focus on painting. I don't do that myself, so that's all I can say with that. Hey, Sean. You live in a very small apartment and want to oil paint, but here thinner is very important to use. Can I use something else instead that doesn't smell like chemicals? Oh, thanks, Treasure. Something that doesn't smell like chemicals. I think Gamsol is one of the safer mineral spirits to use. Is the Gamsol. It says the standard for studio safety, 100% pure odorless mineral spirits. It really doesn't have much of a smell at all. You can use the smallest amount possible, like, I mean, literally next to nothing to thin your paint out. The problem becomes when you have to clean your brushes. So when you're painting, you can use solvent in a small apartment. You'll be fine even if you don't have a window open, as long as you have some kind of ventilation, like like air conditioning or something like that, you'll be fine. The problem becomes when you're cleaning your brushes. So if you live in a small space and you don't have as much ventilation, you might want to clean your brushes at your balcony if you have a balcony with your apartment, or just clean them outside with a little container just like this of mineral spirits, and you'll be fine. I mean, in terms of the air quality, you'll be fine. That's my tip for you. One thing you can use is safflower oil, which doesn't have a strong smell and it does thin paint out. So safflower oil would be probably the answer that you're preferably looking for, since you don't want to use mineral spirits. So use safflower oil to thin the paint off of your brushes before you clean it with soap. It's not going to be the best way to preserve your brushes, but it's one way you can avoid using thinners if you absolutely must. Hey Ian, working on a Rembrandt copy. Oh, cool. Awesome. Hey hippie artist, you're allergic to smells, so Gamsol works for you. Yeah, so Gamsol, like, I would never use like, I don't know, like a hardware store mineral spirits, which I've seen a lot of artists do. That's definitely going to be toxic for you. So as long as you use a small amount at a time, you should be okay. And you only ever really need to dip the brush in the thinner, like in the beginning, like when you're doing an umber drawing or something like that. But you don't really need to use too much when you're working with color like this. Yep, no problem. I'm glad I can help. Dawn soap, yeah, I think I used to use that to clean brushes, but now I use something called the Master Soap. It's a really good soap. See. Uh, yeah, told me I wouldn't ask that question. I don't think that anyone would use that, to be honest. But that kind of question is not going to be good for the stream because of the subject matter. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. Hey, Sage Gel Patel. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad that I was able to inspire you to paint 2 years ago. Am I using straight paint right out of the tubes? Yes. This is right out of the tube. I didn't oil out the face, so all of this is straight paint. I wouldn't even need any thinner right now. I have it out, but I'm not really using it. I'm switching brushes from light to dark. Rather than clean off one brush to go from a light value to a dark value or complementary colors, I'm simply just changing brushes. Notice how frequently I'm standing back, everyone. Always ask yourself, are you standing back enough when you're painting? Let's get you into the close-up again so you can see what I'm doing. If you have something that is dried, do you coat it with linseed oil before working on it again? Okay, so that's similar. That's pretty much the same as oiling out a painting. You're like, since this is dry, if I cover it with linseed oil, so yeah, that is a similar concept. When I oil out, I use well, sometimes I'll just use straight up medium, which is the Neo-Megilp. Other times I'll use a mixture that is linseed oil mixed with 50-50. So it's half linseed oil and half spike lavender oil, which I put in a little tube, a little dripper, and then I oil it out with a sponge. I don't know where it is, but as usual, I tend to lose stuff. But yeah, you could do that to oil out, but only if you are going to be finishing that painting soon. But to be honest, I mean, modern paint chemistry these days, modern materials are pretty good. So even if you break some rules here and there, you'll be okay. You'll be fine. Oh, good question. Good question. Hey, Tommy. Oh, no worries about the question. Yeah, we could just leave it there. Yeah. Yeah, but don't worry, Tommy. Anything art related, other than that, we can talk about. You're all good. Don't worry. Don't be afraid, my friend. You're fine. So let's see. Question. So why do people mix certain oils into their paint? Clove, walnut, linseed, etc. Okay, good question. This I can definitely answer. So some people will mix, say, clove oil or linseed oil or walnut oil, any oil that has the property of slowing down the rate that paints dry, they will add that in with a little dripper or something. You'll see it that they'll add a drop of clove oil or something like that into their paints because it will make their paints dry more slowly. So one reason you want to add a medium to your paint directly is to manipulate the time it takes for your paint to dry. That is the reason why someone would add something like clove oil. Another thing that you can do is add something that will dry faster into your paints. So that would be like liquid, any kind of alkyd medium. I think honestly the best one to use to speed up the drying time if you add it directly to your paint are alkyd oil paints. So add a little bit of alkyd white to your white, add a little bit of alkyd yellow ochre to your yellow ochre, and that will help your paints dry moderately faster. And depending on how fast you want it to dry, just add more alkyd paint to it if you want it to dry faster. Add less to it if you want it to dry not as fast. A good question, good question. Another thing that we can't really control unless you've got lots of money is the humidity, the air quality in your studio. So for example, my lead white now is acting differently. because there's not as much humidity in the air. So it is actually drying a little bit more slowly. So actually, is that true? No, it's drying a little bit faster. What am I thinking? So if it's less humidity in the air, so if the air is more dry, your paint should dry a little bit faster, and it should be a little less pasty. I noticed this is not the case with titanium white. Titanium white is going to be titanium white. It's not going to act differently, but if you're working with lead white, humidity will affect it. I know from experience. Hey hippie artist, using linseed oil helps with working wet on wet, even if over a few days. Okay, so over a few days, linseed oil might not be as slow of a dryer. If you're trying to work days at a time, wet on wet, which I do not recommend, I don't recommend you try to work wet on wet for more than a day, and I can explain that in a second, but you would want to use clove oil. Add clove oil to your paints, and then all of a sudden you can paint wet on wet for days. Or use water mixable oil paints, which take a long time to dry, and you can work on it for days. I've done that before. Okay, so here's the reason you don't want to, if you can avoid it, don't work on your paintings wet on wet for days. And the number one reason you don't want to work on your painting wet on wet for days is that you are manipulating the characteristics of oil paint too much. Oil paint is not meant to be worked on wet on wet for days. Oil paint is meant to stay workable for a couple hours at a time, because painters don't typically work a couple hours at a time, or more than a couple hours at a time in one spot. They will move around typically. So if you're making your paints dry that slow, you're manipulating the paint too much, and you run a much higher risk of something just not going well with your surface quality, your surface texture. Yeah, clove oil. You can, I mean, you can use it to like preserve your paints if you want to. I know that one of my students that was taking a class in person, he would put his paints in a box with a cotton ball dipped in clove oil taped onto a bottle cap or something like that, and like the vapor or something from the clove oil would keep his paints from drying too quickly in his paint box. So I mean, you can use it to prevent your paint from drying too much. I've seen others use a spray bottle of clove oil on their painting if they're taking a workshop. So if you're taking a workshop and it's a 2-day workshop and you can only work on your painting those 2 days, you either want your painting to be touch dry the next day, so use alkyd and only work for an hour, or if you're taking a workshop that's like 4 hours each day, so 4 hours Monday, 4 hours Tuesday, for example, then you would want your paint to be wet the next day. That is an extremely specific circumstance because I've been there before. I've had the same thing happen to me back when I was like a teenager. I think that was the last time I did a class like that. Let's see. Can I use paint thinner for the whole painting from start to finish? Yes, you can, but I don't recommend it. In the end, you want to oil out your painting at least once or twice. And what I would suggest is to buy cold pressed linseed oil. Cold pressed linseed oil, not just refined linseed oil. and mix half of it. Actually, I found my tube. Okay, so use half linseed oil, cold pressed, and half solvent, and put it in a little dripper like this. And then you can add some droplets to your dry painting. Make sure it's completely dry. And then either use a paintbrush or use a sponge, an artist's sponge, and use that to oil out the painting. But remember, I didn't oil out this painting because of the reasons I said in the beginning. I don't want to make it too confusing. So let's move into close-up so you can see what I've done. I started to pull out the form underneath of the eyelid, the tear bag. If you're a fan of Rembrandt, the tear bag, this area underneath of the lower eye, is a very Rembrandtish thing. I'm making that term up. A Rembrandtian kind of thing to be able to do, effect to be able to have in a portrait painting. So the more you can describe the structure specifically around the eyes, the more you begin to understand Rembrandt. Rembrandt is one of the best portrait painters that ever existed, and he understood that the eyes were very much the most captivating part of the human form, and he understood how to describe them in a very very what's a good word for that? Not detailed, but very abbreviated sense. Like very abbreviated, like not like a photograph kind of level of detail, but just enough information to convey life. Kind of a lot to talk about. This stream was very complicated, a little complex. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad that I'm helpful. So we basically went to town on this eye. We put a lot of structure in here, and it took the whole hour. And if it takes you a whole hour to do something like this, do it. Invest the time to do this, because this is what makes, like, this little section here is what makes a study of a Rembrandt truly a study of a Rembrandt. And then we're going to move to the nose, the other eye, and the shadow, and all of that stuff. Woman in Esteem, Rembrandt. Let me see. I'm going to look it up on my computer. Steam? Oh, you mean stream? Stream, I think. Oh, okay, in a stream. Oh, that's possible. There's all kinds of hidden meanings in that painting. I know exactly what painting you're talking about. That's possible. I will keep that on my computer. I'll have to think about it. Yeah, don't worry. It's I kind of knew it as soon as I was typing it. It was a stream. Yeah. I know what you mean. I'll keep that one in mind. Perhaps we can do that one in the future. So I will keep that in mind. All right, so it is 3:30. Like I said, I only had about an hour to work on this one today. So this is the point where I'll ask if there are any last minute questions. And while you're typing out your last minute questions, I will do what I usually do and talk about my online classes. Hopefully my internet doesn't cut out at this point. So remember, my online classes are similar to this in the sense where I'm painting and talking, but the difference is, and I'm going to talk about the $10 a month tier, is that you have the ability to send up to two images of your artworks to me each week for a pre-recorded video that I call the virtual classroom, where I give students advice on their artworks. You have the ability to send me these images of your own artworks each week. And another thing that is different is that the online classes are set up in such a way that I've got skill levels. So if you're a very beginner, you can start off with projects that are a very beginner, and then I've got projects that are more and more advanced for students that want to take on more advanced projects. Online classes are linked in the description box of this video, and you are definitely free to ask me any questions that you have, art related as well, on my Patreon, because I do check those messages as frequently as possible. I check them even more than I text messages. You know anyone close to me? Ask them if Yupari responds to his text messages. He probably doesn't, because I'm looking at those messages as frequently as I can. So let's see if there are any questions. So do I know about painting dirty? Oh, you mean like, so some people call dirt like an ugly color, which I don't believe there's such a thing as an ugly color, just a color that's not related properly to another color. So if I were to mix Alizarin Crimson and this green, if I were to mix red and green perfectly, get a brown, put the brown right there, it's in the wrong spot, so it's going to look dirty. It's going to look like there's a poop stain on his forehead. However, if I get that red and that green, mix it, and put it in the right spot, maybe like right there, it's not going to look like poop anymore. It's going to look like a warmish red undertone underneath of a reflected light. So it's all about color relationships in that sense. So hippie artist question. So it's fat over lean, use thinner at the beginning, more oil paint, less thinner. Let's see. On the later layers. Yes, that is correct. You want to use less thinner in the later layers. Also, you just want to use less slow drying stuff. Less fast drying stuff in the later layers. Earlier layers, you want to dry faster. Later layers, you want to dry slower. This is the basic idea, one of the basic ideas behind fat over lean. So to make it more simple, in the beginning, use little to no medium. In the middle, introduce a little more medium. In the end, you can use even more medium up to the point where you are glazing entire sections at a time. It looks like my internet behaved pretty well this time. Let's see. Easiest way to learn values. That's from Hippie Artist. Let's see. Yes, the $10 a month, you're able to send me images each week for advice. You don't have to send images every single week. I don't put that pressure on anyone. You're just able to send me images each week for the virtual classroom. It gives you the ability to do that. And then, of course, each tier builds onto the previous tier. But more of that is in the description of the Patreon. That's the easiest way to learn values. I wouldn't say there's an easiest way to learn values, but there's easier ways to learn values. One of them is going to be to work with a certain number of values. So give yourself like maybe like 4 values to start with, and do something more simple like a landscape, something like that, like a picture of a landscape, and just create it with 4 values. And then you can see like this value did this value did that, and then you'll see there's a lot of overlaps. So one value here could be the same value here. They're just a different color. So work with a certain number of values with a simple subject like a landscape or an egg or some kind of still life of a box or something like that. That will be one of the easier ways to have an introduction to values. All right, so looks like we don't have any extra last minute questions, I don't think. And remember, there's going to be about I'm going to say an 85% chance I will be back tomorrow around this time, between 2:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Remember, these live streams are going to possibly be held between Tuesday and Friday, 2:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I will most likely continue working on master studies just like this one because of how important they are to building our skills as portrait painters and painters in general. Once again, thank you all so much. I wish you the very best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.